Hello everyone, my name is David McMurdo and welcome to Experiential Spirituality, Episode 4, Hell is Murky. As ever, I'm on Twitter and I've got a curious cat account where you can ask me anything you might want to ask me. I said last week that I'm not on Twitter hardly at all, and that was true, but in the last week I've made more of an effort to post there, so I have been tweeting a fair amount for me this week. I've also cleaned out all of my social media accounts, including YouTube. I removed the vast majority of videos that were on this channel, not because my position on anything that I've said previously has changed, but simply because I feel that my approach in the past wasn't necessarily always the best. I felt that I brought in too many things that served as a distraction from what was actually important, especially concerning myself. In the past, I've tended to be very open about myself and what's going on in my personal life whenever I made a video, whenever I was doing a live stream, and that's just because that's the way I am. That's the nature of my personhood. But I feel it can become too much of a distraction because the important thing is not me. In fact, I'm the least important thing in my personhood. What's important is what I'm saying. And I feel that many times in the past where I've talked about my personal life or where I've just happened to speak about something that's going on in my personal life, just in a light-hearted fashion, it served as a distraction more than anything else. So I'd rather really focus on the subject matter at hand. I think in most other areas, it's useful if you have someone who is open about their personal life and the way I was. But when it comes to spirituality, I don't think that's useful at all because, as I like to say, personhood is fundamentally the problem, and so that kind of thing shouldn't serve as an obstacle to what's important, which is the message itself, and certainly not me. So I really like the way things are going with experiential spirituality. I've got a nice routine now, and it's a routine that allows me to spend as little time doing or engage with this as possible. I do my live streams at 1 p.m. GMT on a Sunday, as I'm doing now, and it takes YouTube about 12 hours to allow me to fully process the streams that I do and to then allow me to download them. So the next day I download the stream that I did on YouTube and then I upload it to BitChute, and then I'll clip something from that stream to upload on the Thursday. That's the format that's kind of developed organically, and that's what I intend to stick with unless I've got a reason to change the way that I do things. So in the first episode of Experiential Spirituality, I talked about how people misunderstand the nature of the spiritual search, how they typically expect to find spiritual realities out there in the external world. And I explained that actually the spiritual quest takes place inside oneself. In the second episode, I explained how our awareness is our spirit, and I spent almost the entire episode talking about that. In the third episode, I talked about the great power that we have as spirit and how that power is something that most people overlook, like the spirit itself, and that power is our attention, because our awareness is our spirit. That's what we are. And as I said, attention is focused awareness. In this video, I'm going to speak about hell. Now, it may seem like that's an odd subject to choose for only the fourth episode. It may seem like that would be something that comes further down the line. And it may also seem that I should talk about heaven first. That would seem more intuitive somehow. But there's a reason that I need to deal with hell, and it relates to what I said towards the end of last week's episode. It's that we don't have to go anywhere to come to discover the truth with a capital T. We don't have to go anywhere, travel any distance to be what we already are as spirit, and to be united with the Absolute, because we already are united by the Absolute by our very nature. The spiritual journey, if you want to call it that, or the spiritual quest, the mystic initiation, it's not about attaining a new state or arriving in some new place. It's about coming to recognize the state that is eternally ours. It's about coming to recognize what we by nature are and always will be. So what the spiritual journey is really about is undoing the conditioning that we've acquired through a lifetime here in the material realm. The conditioning that ends up having us be immersed and attached to personhood, the personhood that blinds us to our true nature. So spirituality is really about undoing that conditioning and clearing away the rubble, most of it intellectual, that obscures the truth of what you are. And the reason I'm starting with the subject of hell is that most people exist in a form of hell, and they dwell in different forms of hell before they are able to liberate themselves from that and then arrive at that state that we might call a heavenly state, before they enter the kingdom of heaven, as it were. And so because that's where most souls begin, it's useful to speak about hell, what it is, how souls get dragged there, why they remain there, and of course most importantly, how they escape from that. Now, this is obviously a massive subject, and I could approach it from many different angles, but to illustrate, I think the best way to illustrate the importance of this is to explain something about weak questions. A weak question, in spiritual terms, is a question that has nothing to do with your direct experience of reality. And the vast majority of souls, when they begin on what you might call their spiritual journey, they begin with those weak questions. That's how I began the spiritual journey. When I was younger and I was interested in the big questions in life, when I refer to the big questions, it's those weak questions that I mean. Things like, is reincarnation a reality? Just things that might be interesting to think about and to speculate about, but things that ultimately have nothing to do with your direct experience, and things that have nothing to do with your life in the present. And as I say, it's very common for spiritual seekers to begin asking those questions, and those questions can serve to propel and to drive people into deeper areas, but at a certain point they have to be recognized for what they are, which is a distraction from those more important issues relating to one's state of being and one's present experience. And sometimes those questions, although the asker isn't aware of it, sometimes those questions are really, they're relevant, but not in the way that the questioner thinks they're relevant. So let's take the question, do ghosts exist? For many souls, that is a very exciting question. It's a very exciting thing to speculate about. Now, the funny thing about most of those weak questions is that it really doesn't matter what answer I give to them, or anyone gives to them. If someone asks me, do ghosts exist in the sense of external ethereal beings or phantoms, I might say yes or I might say no, but what difference does it make to you, and what can you do with that information? Absolutely nothing. But there are such a thing as ghosts, in the sense that many souls in this world, perhaps even most, are haunted by certain intellectual constructs, usually memories. Those are the ghosts that souls should really be concerned with, because it's those ghosts that have a direct impact on their state of being and their experience of reality. See, the reason that an initiate must eventually come to recognize these supposed big questions for the distraction that they are is that they are the mind's way at a certain point of taking them down all these rabbit trails so that they never face the most important issue, so that they never ask the more important and deeper questions that would ultimately lead them beyond the mind. And so a weak question, again, is one that, while it may be interesting to the mind, and that's why souls tend to ask those questions, because they're appealing to the mind, they allow the mind to speculate and to go off on flights of fancy, which is always fun for the mind loves to do that. While they might be entertaining and enjoyable, and while they might serve a purpose to propel one initially on the spiritual quest, they ultimately have to be abandoned for the more important questions, because the answer to questions like, does reincarnation exist in the exoteric sense, in the sense of souls being reborn into physical bodies, it's an interesting question, and there is an answer to it, but it's not relevant to your present state of being. It's not relevant to your day-to-day experience of life. If your day-to-day experience of life is miserable, then why do you even care about those questions? For most souls, quite honestly, when they ask weak questions like that, questions like, does reincarnation exist in the exoteric sense, they'd be better off asking questions like, why do I suffer from such major mood swings and thereby ruin my relationships? Why do I exist in a state of seemingly permanent depression? Those questions, while more mundane to the mind, they are certainly far more important than those questions that excite the mind, because they pertain to one's experience of reality. And so seemingly big questions can serve as a distraction from the more important issues. And I think a lot of souls want to avoid asking those more relevant questions because it requires them to be more honest with themselves. It doesn't take any effort, it doesn't take any courage at all to just idly speculate about whether certain grandiose things are reality or not. But it does take a certain degree of courage and a certain degree of self-awareness and a willingness to be honest with oneself to face those issues that every soul, well, most souls, know perfectly well that they have. And so those big questions can ultimately serve as a distraction and give souls an excuse never to face those deeper realities. So I want to talk about hell in this video because, again, most souls exist in some form of hell, and I need to explain what hell is. And the title of this show is Hell is Murky. And that's a line from William Shakespeare's Macbeth. For those of you who don't know, William Shakespeare's Macbeth is about Macbeth, who was an 11th century figure, and his wife planning to kill the King of Scotland, King Duncan. So they plan to kill King Duncan and they succeed. And what happens after killing King Duncan is that whereas Macbeth previously, he was someone who was quite honourable and he was reluctant to murder King Duncan, after killing King Duncan and he becomes king himself, he becomes very ambitious and he becomes increasingly brutal in the things that he's prepared to do in order to maintain his power, something that his wife did not anticipate. Lady Macbeth thought that, if I can just convince my noble, honourable and unwilling husband to murder King Duncan, then he'll be king, I'll be queen, and everything will be fine from them. She didn't anticipate that Macbeth would essentially get a taste for that kind of brutality and become the infamous tyrant he did, according to the play. So whereas Macbeth, after killing King Duncan, becomes increasingly brutal, Lady Macbeth, being unable to bear the fact that they murdered King Duncan and being unable to bear the terrible things she begins to witness her husband doing, she starts going mad. And there's one scene in particular that takes place not long before her suicide, where she has a complete mental breakdown, and in the play she says lots of random things, And one of the random things she says is hell is murky. There are those who cite Shakespeare as if it is scripture, as if Shakespeare's words are words from a sacred text. And I don't think, well, no one to my knowledge believes that literally, but I understand why they do that, because Shakespeare's works are just packed full of insight. Shakespeare just had such a great insight on the way that human beings are, and a great insight on psychology. And the reason that I love that statement of Lady Macbeth, hell is murky, is because it's hard to imagine a more accurate description of what the experience of hell is. Hell, when religion is understood on a purely exoteric level, hell, when it's understood in the most crude manner possible, is taken to be a place existing perhaps somewhere beneath the earth. Or perhaps it's seen as some spiritual dimension somewhere that we enter into after death. But hell, in actual fact, is nothing more than a tormented mind. And both heaven and hell are not exclusively afterlife states, though they are that, but they are also fundamentally states of being. In fact, it's because heaven and hell are states of being that they become afterlife states. Because if one is in a hellish state of being when one's physical body dies, there is no reason to suppose that that torment will end. They will simply go on to be tormented just without a physical body, and that's what most would take to be hell. But hell is torment of the mind, and recognizing that, you can recognize that a great many souls around the world live in hell on a day-to-day basis. They are tormented by all kinds of mental phenomenon on a day-to-day basis, whether it be memories, whether it be fears, whether it be anxieties. It could be absolutely anything. But you can tell a soul who is in hell, even as they exist in human form, just by looking at them in many cases. And certainly their conduct and their behaviour is the best indication of that. But what's important to understand about hell and those souls in it is that they choose to be there, and you might even say they deserve to be there. They are certainly responsible for being there. So I want to use two examples of such souls and explain why that is. Hell is psychological torment, and I don't know about those of you watching, but I'm sure you have. I wonder if you, like me, have encountered souls in hell before, souls who really have no control over, or seem to have no control over their own life, and they may engage in the abuse of all kinds of substances, they may not, but they tend to be really hostile a lot of the time, and sometimes they can even be sympathetic, but overall they're quite destructive. Now, and on those occasions where you might be willing to extend them sympathy because they are clearly tormented by whatever is going on in their head, in many cases, in fact in every case that I've experienced personally, if you try to help them or explain what the problem is, then very often you'll be met with hostility, because while you might be tempted to be sympathetic towards such a soul, what always lies, the reason that souls end up in hell is always a matter of ego. It's always related to the ego somehow, that which I also call personhood. Personhood is really a form of ego. There are other ego forms, other forms of egoic identity besides personhood, but personhood is the most common form of egoic identity. Souls end up in their hells, first of all, through their own efforts, and second of all, because of their absorption in personhood. And what you find with souls those really aggressive souls who are clearly existing in some kind of hell is that behind it all is this hubris. Because as miserable as they experience their reality as being, there is almost always this hubris there. This idea they have that despite their terrible experience of reality, despite the fact that they never have a moment's peace and seem to have no control over their lives whatsoever, there is this hubris there that leads them to nonetheless believe that they know better than everyone else. And so if you try to help them in any way, or if even you try to explain to them the ways that they might lead a less tormented life, things that might help them out, even something as simple as to not drink or do drugs or whatever it might be that's making their psychological torment worse, you're in most cases going to be met with outright aggression. Because again, at the centre of it all is their ego, their personhood. Despite their experience of reality, they still think they know better than you. Even though your experience of life, as far as they can tell, is perfectly fine and you don't have any problems whatsoever, and theirs is a living misery, nonetheless, they still think they know better than you. And that's why I say that souls who are in hell, as it were, who undergo that psychological torment, they earn it for themselves, and they remain there because they cling on to their egoic identities strongly, and in many cases are outright hubristic about it, and so in that sense they deserve to be there. And that's why you can characterize hell as a punishment, because I don't typically talk in terms of divine punishment and judgment and things like that, but you can certainly characterize these experiences as being just that, because there is such a thing as karma, and karma has been mystified in many ways. Karma has been associated with all kinds of things that it doesn't really relate to, and there are many different ways to understand karma, but the simplest way to understand karma is as cause and effect. You do this, it will produce this effect. And that's what these souls in hell have done. They have in their own way refused to humble themselves. They have become absorbed in personhood, and they have become hubristic. And the more hubristic a soul becomes, having become attached to personhood, the more suffering they will incur as a consequence of that. And that's why you could quite easily characterize that hellish experience as a form of punishment. What is going to break that kind of, shall we say, unsympathetic soul out of the destructive cycle that they live in is nothing you or anyone else can say to them. It's going to be the experience of suffering itself. At a certain point, they will have suffered to such an extent that they'll realise they have no other choice but to seek an alternative, because the suffering that they've made themselves undergo, with time, it will eventually serve to humble them. Their ego will fracture, and that's when they might be willing to listen to someone else. They might be willing to consider that they don't know everything, that they're not right, and that their hellish experience of reality is proof of that, which indeed it is. But that's the only point such unsympathetic souls are going to be willing to change. And so until that happens, there's very little reason, there's very little purpose in trying to reach them, because they just won't be reached. So that's an example of hell, and that's an example of the kind of more unsympathetic soul you can get in hell. One who is destructive in their behaviour, but one who ultimately has put themselves there due to their bad decisions, and most crucially, due to their attachment to personhood and their refusal to acknowledge that they might be wrong. Despite their suffering, they refuse to acknowledge that there might be a better way to live life. It's amazing that you can have someone who just truly lives a hellish experience, who doesn't know what happiness is, who doesn't know a moment's peace unless they're unconscious, when they're asleep. And despite that, they'll still look at you as if you're the stupid one if you try to impart any advice to them. Maybe a lot of you haven't had that experience, but I have. It's quite an eye-opener to undergo. But let's move on to a more sympathetic example to demonstrate how hell, psychological torment, is the result always of egoic identity. And this sympathetic example is especially important. So let's take someone who loses a family member. Let's take a mother, for example, whose son dies. Now, when that mother's son dies, she will undergo suffering. The question is why, and how does it relate to the egoic identity? Well, it's quite simple. Her egoic identity is, of course, one of personhood, and part of that egoic identity, part of that personhood, is the notion that she is a mother. And so this notion is dependent upon the existence of that soul to whom she is a mother to, in this case, the son in our scenario. So if that son dies, that the idea that soul, that woman has of who she is naturally shaken, because something that was part of her egoic identity, the way she sees herself, in this case as a mother, something that was crucial to that identification has been taken away, and so her entire identity is shaken. And I've found it very interesting because it's quite a, you hear it mostly in films these days. You do hear it in real life sometimes, but you mostly hear it in films. But certainly those who hear it, who've ever undergone any kind of personal loss, as indeed I have, they'll certainly be able to relate to it, even if it does mostly show up in films and things like that. But sometimes souls will say, usually in very serious circumstances where they've lost a partner, a child, or a close relative, they'll say, I feel like a piece of me has died. And that's very interesting because in almost every case, the soul has no idea just how right they are. They are completely right for the reasons I just explained, is that most souls living in human form, they have an egoic identity that they're deeply invested in. Other souls that they have relationships with become part of that egoic identity. They become part of the way that that soul understands themselves. So if one of those souls dies physically and is no longer present in the life of that soul who has that egoic identity that involved them, then again their reality is shaken, because that other soul who is no longer there as far as they can tell is gone, and therefore a part of them has disappeared too. And the way they understand themselves and the way they understand their place in reality, to go back to our example of the mother, the way that soul understands itself as a mother and the way it understands its place as a mother in the world, that is completely undermined, and therefore there is this great upheaval within. And that's why in such circumstances souls feel entirely lost and they don't know who they are anymore, and they feel a despair that they find difficult to articulate. So obviously anyone who has known or does know someone who has lost a close relative, or in the case of our example, someone who's known a mother who's lost a son, any soul is naturally going to be sympathetic towards that entity, as they should be. My point in giving that example is to again demonstrate that even in the most sympathetic cases, the kind of hell that comes about, the kind of torment that we undergo in our minds, it always relates to egoic identity. The more you're invested in your egoic identity, the more you're invested in your identity as a human being, the more you will suffer whenever that identity is shaken or threatened in some way. And I want to give an example of a more unsympathetic soul, as I did with the first example, and an example of a very sympathetic soul, as I did with the mother, to show that in both cases you can clearly trace the reason for their psychological torment after a certain event back to the ego, because it really does all come down to the ego. And so the most obvious thing to talk about now is how one would escape from hell. And I think that anyone who's watched my videos for any length of time will know the answer to this. It's interesting, and it only just occurred to me as I was waiting for this to go live. But I've many times before described the spiritual journey, or I've said that one way you can characterize the spiritual journey is as a process of surrender. I've said that many times before, and there really isn't a religion that I'm familiar with that you couldn't characterize in that same way, for the very reason that genuine spirituality is fundamentally a process of surrender. You're not trying to attain a new state of being, you're not trying to get anywhere, you just have to surrender, specifically your attachment, and especially your attachment to your egoic identity or your personhood. And every religion can characterize its spiritual path as surrender. Christians would say we must surrender to the will of God, or we must surrender to Christ. Muslims would say, we must surrender to the will of Allah. A very common sentiment within Islam. Buddhists would certainly talk about surrender. In fact, I think Buddhists talk about surrender more overtly than anyone else. But in every case, a religionist could characterize the process of spirituality that their tradition takes them through as surrender, because again, all genuine spirituality is surrender. And so the way to escape hell, that kind of psychological torment, that kind of suffering, is through surrender. Because when you're bound up in personhood, and especially when you're hubristic, as that soul in my first example was, you're constantly trying to fight to prevail against certain things, especially in the case of those souls who think they know better than everyone else. You're constantly trying to fight, you're constantly trying to assert yourself in the most literal sense possible. But to go back to what I said about that soul in the first example, at a certain point the suffering will become such, and a soul will have suffered for so long due to their own delusions, that they will recognize that they can't do it themselves. And what do they do at that point? They surrender. In fact, this is how many spiritual awakenings occur. I'm sure you've heard many testimonies of people, I know I have, of people, especially within the Christian faith, because we live in the West, where they've undergone some trauma in their lives, they've undergone some kind of suffering, and at a certain point they just break down, and not knowing what else to do, being absolutely desperate, they call out to God, or they call out to Jesus, and it's that point that they have what they usually describe as their born again experience. And that's exactly what's going on. After fighting in their own strength, to use biblical terminology, after trying to work in the flesh to please God, as it were, or to get their own way, they finally realized that just doesn't work, it just can't happen. And out of despair, because they've suffered so much, or they are currently suffering so much, they surrender to God, and there's, as I like to say, there's a crack in their ego, and that allows the light of grace to shine through. And so at that point they finally genuinely surrender, and they have some form of transcendent experience. Is a very common testimony. But that is not only the way to escape hell, that is the way to say progress in spirituality, but that is the goal of spirituality as a whole, is simply to surrender. There's no need to do anything. You just have to surrender and let God be God, and you be you in the place that God has put you. That's really all that is required. And so it's easy to understand that in the context of the first example I gave of the unsympathetic soul, because that unsympathetic soul, very destructive in their behavior, very hubristic, despite their miserable experience of reality, they nonetheless still think that they're better than everyone else, and because of that, they'll refuse to take any advice at all because they think they've got it all figured out. It's easy to understand why surrender would help that soul, because after having suffered so much, they finally surrender and they're willing to listen to others, and perhaps even they're willing to reach out to the divine in the way that I just described, and hopefully the grace of God that has always been there will be recognized by them. But what about the second example I gave, the more sympathetic example, the example of the mother who loses a son? And as I explained, the reason souls suffer in such circumstances is because, and this is true of everyone, I'm just using this example, it's been true of me in the past when relatives have died, and it's going to be true in the future when other relatives die, and it's going to have been true of you as well. But let's stick with my example of this mother who loses her son. How would surrender help in her case, or how would it apply in her case? It would apply in her case simply by recognizing that personhood is fundamentally illusory, which is to say that it is transitory. Everything about our personhood changes. I explained how that is and why that is in the very first episode of Experiential Spirituality. But our personhood develops over time, and because of that conditioning, as spirit, as souls living in human form, we become attached to our personhood. We become enamored by it. And that's what causes suffering whenever something changes with that personhood. In this case, because this soul identifies so strongly as a mother, and because her son is so central to that identification, when that son dies in physical terms and is no longer there for that soul to interact with, that soul's entire identity is undermined. So the reason that surrender is appropriate in that context is because that soul, in order to undergo that grief or to move past that occurrence, they must recognize that such things are transitory by their very nature. They must surrender to that. They must surrender to the fact that this person was a part of their life and was part of the egoic identity that we all have. And this would be a good time to restate that it's not that you can ever be rid of your egoic identity, and you wouldn't want to be either. I don't operate wandering around this town not having a name being something that's part of an egoic identity. No, I understand that other souls see me as David McMurdo. That's how they see me. They see me in solely fleshly terms, and so I speak to them in those terms. We need an egoic identity to function. The issue is not whether one has an egoic identity, and the goal is not to abolish the egoic identity. That would be a bad idea while you live in human form. The question is, the important aspect is, how attached are you to that egoic identity? Because as long as you're attached to the egoic identity, as long as you're attached to your sense of personhood, you will, to lesser and greater degrees, suffer your experience of reality. And so just as the soul that I spoke of in my first example needed to surrender because she had become massively hubristic and wasn't prepared to listen to anyone else, and so surrender would allow her to escape from hell. In the case of the more sympathetic mother, she needs to surrender to the fact that personhood and those things that become attached to personhood, like the relationships we form, they are transitory. And such a soul, if they were seeing things from the highest perspective, they would be grateful for the experience that they had with that other soul who was temporarily in their life. Ultimately, all souls in human form are temporarily in our lives because, of course, we all die. But that soul, as the mother, needs to recognize that just as there was a time where she wasn't a mother before her son was born, so too there would inevitably become a time where she would not be a mother anymore, one way or the other, because that's the transitory nature of things. And recognizing the transitory nature of personhood, one who is wise does not get attached to it, especially not as they come to know themselves as the transcendent spirit, as I described in the first 3 episodes of Experiential Spirituality. And this is a good time to say something that I've wanted to say, but there hasn't really been an appropriate time to say it. But this is highly appropriate, which is that I always emphasize that there is, of course, a difference between matter, mind, and spirit. That's the way we divide up reality, and it's important to emphasize that difference so that you don't mistake one for the other, because it's very common for souls to mistake, for example, intellectual activities that relate to the spiritual with spirituality itself. So I always emphasize the distinctions of matter, mind, and spirit, but none should get the impression that I'm contemptuous of either matter or mind, and therefore contemptuous of human beings. In fact, from the highest perspective, and when what I'm saying is understood aright, you'll see that I actually bestow the highest respect on human beings. See, I talk about how matter is by nature transitory, which it is. I talk about how the mental phenomenon, intellectual phenomenon, is by nature transitory, and so it is. But that doesn't mean I have contempt for either one of them, even as I say that they're obviously inferior to spirit. On the contrary, their transitory nature should make us appreciate them all the more. To go back to the example of someone who loses someone close to them in human terms, that human being is a unique manifestation that will never and can never be repeated again. And so yes, we acknowledge that matter and mind, unlike spirit, is transitory and it will pass away, but in a sense that's what makes it special. That's we're bordering on another subject here, but that's what should make us value these things all the more. It shouldn't make us go, well, human beings are just material things, so who cares, as some ancient Gnostic groups did when they went to the extremes on certain issues. Rather, it should make us appreciate the uniqueness, the literal uniqueness of each human form, of each human being. And so that mother, while surrendering to the reality that all such things are transitory, she should also be grateful and feel gratitude for the fact that she, and she alone, got to experience this unique expression in the material realm. And again, an expression that is so wholly unique that it can never be replicated. No matter how mundane a human being might take their life to be, what is true without doubt is that their life is utterly unique in countless ways. No matter how mundane they take it to be, what's undeniable is the fact that their life is totally unique in so many different regards. And so again, my perspective, while if one understands it wrongly, it could certainly lead one to be contemptuous of the material and of the mental because they're marked as inferior to the spirit, if understood correctly, it should lead one to appreciate those transitory things even more. And I wanted to take the opportunity to say that. Now, having spoken about heaven, even though it's not the subject of this video, and I perhaps will want to speak about it a bit more later on, I need to at least briefly address the issue of heaven. Now, having spoken about hell, it makes sense that I would speak about heaven. Because if hell, as it is torment of the mind, and a torment of the mind that can persist on after the death of the physical form, there's no reason to suppose that once your physical form dies, that's it, because your mind doesn't necessarily die. And that's one catastrophic mistake in certain religious traditions, not major traditions, more offshoots, but to suggest that your state of being as you live in mortal form is completely detached from what your fate will be in the so-called afterlife. That's delusion of the highest order. Your state of being, the way your state of being is while you live in human form is hugely indicative of your fate in the afterlife. There is no bigger indicator. But regardless, having established that hell is torment of the mind, and that many souls living in human form live in a form of hell, and most souls to some degree are haunted at least by certain things in their mind, whether it be memories or anything else, one might be tempted to suppose, therefore, that whereas hell is a mind that is a maelstrom of negative things, heaven, therefore, must be a mind that is filled with beautiful things and pretty things and noble things. Now, a mind that is filled with positive things, a mind that in some way reflects the divine attributes that I talked about last week, that is certainly preferable to a mind that is a maelstrom of negativity and that results in a hellish experience of reality. Certainly preferable, but such a mind is not heaven, and it cannot be precisely because it's of the mind. At best, what you have there is kind of like a counterfeit heaven, but because it exists in the mind and therefore consists of intellectual constructs, it is prone to be overthrown. And this is obvious from just basic experience of reality. There are those who are very pleasant individuals and they seem to have a relatively nice experience of life, but if something occurs in the external world, if something goes wrong in their life, then that happiness, that peace, that joy is completely overthrown. And that's because that's the nature of intellectual phenomenon. You know, the kingdoms you build in your mind, whether they're positive or whether they're negative, they will collapse at some time or another. So you can't build heaven in your mind. You can certainly try, but heaven by nature exists beyond the mind. It exists in the realm of spirit. And it's not composed of any constructs at all, because it transcends those constructs. And to enter the kingdom of heaven is simply to surrender to God in the most profound sense possible and become aware of your true nature as spirit, and with that to become aware of your unity with God, your unity with the Absolute. That is to enter the kingdom of heaven. And when you become aware of that experientially, and having done so are therefore no longer invested in the very egoic identity and in the very personhood, investment into which will ultimately and certainly and inevitably breed suffering, then you have entered a state of bliss that will not be shaken, no matter what happens in the external world and no matter what happens in your personal life, as it were. Finally, I want to say, I think it would be a good idea if I end on this. The way that we have to use certain language to describe things. You know, if I talk about hell, for example, that has certain connotations. And for someone who wants to overcome some hell they're undergoing in their mind on a day-to-day basis, if I say to them, for example, as I would, that, look, as spirit, you transcend both material and mental phenomenon. No matter how hellish that maelstrom is in your mind, that maelstrom ultimately consists of intellectual constructs. And you as spirit, you as the awareness, you are by nature superior to them. You by nature transcend them just by the fact that you are the one perceiving them. They are not perceiving you, and in fact, if it were not for you, they could have no existence at all, because they arise within you and they depend upon you. Now, the mind can be very crafty, because what I'm actually encouraging a soul to do there is to simply recognize their true transcendent state, because an experiential recognition of that true transcendent state will naturally and inevitably pull them out of that intellectual maelstrom of negative emotion that causes them torment. But the mind can be crafty and it can play a clever trick. Because what I've noticed happens so often is that souls to whom I say that to, what they instead take from what I say is that when they have all these negative thoughts, they should think to themselves, I am transcendent spirit, I am above those thoughts. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is that the thought, I am transcendent spirit and I am above those thoughts, is itself just a thought. So right there, you've been tricked by the mind. Again, the mind is very subtle in this way. You've been lured by the mind into engaging with its intellectual matter, even though you were attempting to do otherwise. So to be absolutely clear, you've got to watch for those traps of the mind. When I talk about the fact that you are transcendent spirit, and therefore you will experientially transcend any maelstrom that might exist within the mind, I'm not saying that you should simply think that to yourself and somehow convince yourself of it. I'm saying that you should experientially recognize that. It's not a thought, it's an experiential recognition. A thought will not cause you to rise above mental phenomenon, because it is mental phenomenon. Experiential recognition of your true status as spirit, as the awareness that transcends thought, will do that. And that's the importance of engaging in the kinds of meditation that I talked about. I think it was in the very first episode of Experiential Spirituality, I should imagine. So, although when someone is trying to go back to what I was getting at, when someone is engaged in that kind of practice, and when they're trying to wrestle with all these nuances, and when they're abiding in the awareness that they are, when they're abiding in the spirit that they are, see, when someone goes to meditate, and I say, don't exert any effort at all, not with your attention, not in any regard, because the point of meditation, at least the meditation I advocate, is to simply exist as you are, because since you are spirit, you don't need to exert any effort to become what you are. So simply abide, simply be, and it's as simple as that. Now, obviously, when souls are beginning to do that, they will find it easier if external and mental phenomenon is composed in such a way that it's conductive to doing that. In other words, when they're in a quiet physical environment and when their mind is calm, they will find it easier to sit there and just abide in their own awareness. But when external circumstances become challenging to that practice, and when the mind is very busy, they will naturally find it more difficult. And during those times, they will naturally conceive or interpret or perceive those things that are pulling them away from that peaceful abiding. They will naturally perceive those things as hostile forces, perhaps even as a form of evil that is attempting to pull them away from abiding with God, essentially, which is the truth. And many sacred texts personify such forces in those ways. Satan in the New Testament is nothing but a personification of those lower forces. Go and look at every instance of Satan in the New Testament and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. It's blatantly a personification of those lower forces. Like in the Gospel of John, Yeshua is having his Last Supper with the disciples, and then the narrator says that Satan entered into Judas and he went out to betray Yeshua. You know, these are personifications of forces that we have to contend with while we exist in human form. And yet, to continue with the example of Satan, there's a big clue as to the true nature of these forces and as to their true purpose by the fact that, of course, famously in the Old Testament, like in the book of Job, Satan is on God's divine counsel and he acts on behalf of God, and that's absolutely true. This goes back to what I said in a previous episode when I said that The difficulty with a lot of spiritual teaching is that certain things are true from different perspectives. So, from the perspective of the spiritual seeker who's really just struggling against all this mental phenomenon, this external phenomenon that's threatening to pull them away from simply abiding as they are, from their perspective, certainly it seems that this is an evil, destructive force that is just pulling them away from what's most important. But from a higher perspective, the fact is that those forces, they are there to test them. Everything ultimately works for God. And the more you progress, the more you see very clearly that even those things that you took to be truly hateful, so detrimental were they to your experience of reality, the more you progress on, the more you see that even the most seemingly hateful and destructive of those things, they were ultimately serving you, because without them you could not have been tested, and without being tested you could not have prevailed. The spiritual seeker, the soul living in human form, it cannot, what term will I use here? It cannot surpass, it cannot overcome if there's nothing to overcome in the first place. And it cannot obtain the knowledge and the experience of overcoming unless there is something to overcome. And that is the function that these supposedly negative forces serve. So while one could, to go back to my biblical example, just look at the New Testament in isolation and say, well, Satan is some evil force, the opponent of God. It's a more nuanced understanding, going back to the Hebrew Bible, is the fact that Satan, he certainly has a role to play, and a role that is perceived as negative due to what the role is, but we see, he's sitting up there on the divine counsel of God, and this is all working towards God's end. It's not as if Satan has a chance, it's not as if Satan has a chance to overthrow God. Ultimately, he's doing what God needs him to be doing, and if he wasn't, he wouldn't be there at all. It's not as if you've got this 50-50 boxing match going on where, God might prevail or Satan might prevail. No, God is always in charge. He can't be anything other but be in charge. And so whenever there's something happening, no matter how negative we perceive it to be, we can be assured, and you can be assured, that it is working towards some greater end, specifically for your own spiritual development. Just as the Apostle Paul says in the book of Romans, all things work for good for those who love God, and it's absolutely true. And the more you go on your, what you might call your spiritual journey, again, I'm reluctant to use that term, but the more you go on your spiritual journey, the more you see that even the most hateful and seemingly evil things, although we assign those labels to them because they make our experience of reality negative at different points, the more you progress, the more you will absolutely see that even the worst of them was there ultimately for our benefit. Because if they weren't for our benefit, it would just be what you might call pointless evil. It would just be unnecessary suffering, and there ultimately is no such thing in this reality, because God is in full control, and nothing is without purpose. So thank you very much for watching, everyone, and may your moment be mystical.